probably heard of the war where the only casualty was a pig. That's a real story, but it's the wrong war. This one is even dumber. In 1839, the United States and Britain nearly went to war over a forest full of lumberjacks. They raised tens of thousands of troops, put millions of dollars on the table, hauled cannons through the snow, and even sent war correspondents to cover the fighting. Total combat deaths, 0. The most dangerous thing that happened involved a bear. And the only reason anyone still remembers it, a plate of beans. To understand it, we go back to 1783. The American Revolution had just ended, and Britain and the brand new United States sat down to draw the border between America and British Canada. But when they reached the far northeast, a vast, freezing wilderness of pine forest, they got lazy. The treaty described the border using rivers and highlands that, it turned out, nobody could actually find on a map. They drew a line through a forest they had never seen and left a huge chunk of land in dispute. For 50 years, nobody cared. It was just trees. The trouble was that those trees were worth a fortune. This was the age of wooden ships and wooden everything, and the Aroostook Valley was packed with towering white pines, perfect timber. Both Maine, newly minted as a U.S. state, and the British colony of New Brunswick claimed it. And into this legal gray zone marched the one group who didn't care whose flag flew over the forest: lumberjacks. Canadian and American loggers swarmed in and began cutting down the disputed timber as fast as they possibly could. By the winter of 1839, Maine had had enough of watching Canadian crews haul away what it considered its trees. So the state sent a land agent named Rufus McIntyre, backed by a posse of about 200 men, up into the woods to arrest the trespassing lumberjacks and drive them out. It seemed simple enough. Round up some loggers, make a point, go home. Instead, McIntyre got himself captured. The lumberjacks tipped off the British authorities, who swept in and arrested McIntyre, the very official who had come to arrest them. Now an American government agent was sitting in a Canadian jail. Both sides started grabbing prisoners. Maine militia seized British officials, and the British held Americans. Suddenly, this was no longer a squabble over logging permits. It was an international incident, and both sides began reaching for their muskets. And this is the moment a squabble over trees stops being a squabble. Maine's legislature, furious, voted to spend $800,000 and called up more than 10,000 militiamen to defend the valley. New Brunswick summoned its own forces in reply. Drums beat, men marched north through the snow, and two English-speaking neighbors who had every reason to stay friendly began seriously preparing to kill each other over pine trees. Then Washington got involved, and the numbers turned absurd. Congress authorized the president to call up as many as 50,000 troops and to spend $10 million, a staggering sum for the time, to fight over the border. 50,000 soldiers, $10 million, for a stretch of frozen forest that, just a few weeks earlier, most Americans didn't even know existed. What followed looked exactly like a real war, it just forgot the fighting. Both sides built forts and blockhouses, sometimes within sight of each other across the river. Cannons were dragged into position, troops drilled in the bitter cold, and newspapers, smelling a great story, dispatched war correspondents to the front lines to report on the coming battle. Everyone was ready. The stage was set, and then nothing happened. But the real enemy was never the other army. It was the cold, the mud, and the boredom. Marching thousands of men into a frozen Maine, winter turned out to be far easier to order than to survive. Soldiers shivered in half-built forts and ran low on supplies as the Grand War became one giant, miserable camping trip. And the men had a lot of time to complain about the food. And the food is exactly why this whole affair got its name. The men in the woods were fed a relentless, monotonous diet of army rations, pork and beans. Pork and beans, day after day after day after day. They grumbled about it so bitterly that, as the story goes, the entire conflict was mockingly christened the Pork and Beans War, quite possibly the only war in history named after its catering. But here's where it could all have gone horribly wrong. With thousands of armed, freezing, bean-fed men glaring at each other across a river, the whole thing was one accident away from a genuine bloodbath. So the United States sent in its most trusted troubleshooter, General Winfield Scott, a celebrated war hero. But Scott hadn't come to fight. He had come to do something far harder, to talk everyone down before some trigger-happy militiamen started a war that nobody actually wanted. Scott quietly worked both sides, leaning on old friendships among the British commanders, and brokered a deal. Both sides would pull their forces back and let diplomats settle the border in peace. The militiamen, cold, homesick, and thoroughly sick of beans, were only too happy to pack up and leave. The Great Aroostook War was over, without the two armies ever actually fighting each other. So after all the marching, the forts, and the 50,000-man authorization, how many soldiers did the enemy actually kill? Not one. Around 36 men did die during the crisis, but every single one from disease or accidents in the miserable winter camps, never from enemy fire. In fact, the closest this war came to real combat was the night a group of jumpy soldiers heard gunshots in the dark forest and opened fire in a panic at what turned out to be a black bear. Tens of thousands of troops mobilized, and the fiercest firefight of the whole war was against wildlife. 3 years later, in 1842, cooler heads finally finished the job with a treaty, the Webster-Ashburton Treaty, that calmly drew the border which still separates Maine and Canada to this day. The line that two nations had nearly gone to war over was, in the end, settled by two diplomats and a map, exactly as it could have been all along. Today, the Aroostook War is a footnote, remembered mostly for its ridiculous nickname. But it's a perfect little snapshot of a young, hot-headed nation, one that could leap from a logging dispute to authorizing 50,000 troops in a matter of weeks. As the United States turns 250, it's worth remembering that its story isn't only soaring speeches and glorious battles. Sometimes it's two countries, $10 million, and an entire army nearly going to war over pine trees and a plate of beans.